Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Torah Talk. Tonight with Rabbi Michael Skobac from JewsForJudaism.ca, Mishpatim, Exodus chapter 21. Rabbi, thank you so much for being able to join me again tonight. I have been tossing you like waves on a wind, like the wind on a wave, whatever. You know what I'm saying?
We've had a very rough ride.
It has been challenging. Let's just say that for sure. Well, this is good. I'm glad to have you back. I'm glad this is all working out just peachy. So God willing, Hashem willing, this thing will ride the full ride, and we'll have a good, clean episode shot here and be able to take Torah to the nations. Yes.
God willing. God willing.
Man.
Okay.
Yes, indeed.
So,
Rabbi, let's just take it off when you're ready, and I'll follow you the best I can, okay?
We'll go slow. We'll make it painless.
Sounds good. All right, here we go. So,
Mishpatim basically means ordinances. These are laws. It's mainly 3 chapters here, 21, 22, 4 chapters, 21 through 24 of Exodus. And Mishpatim, this Parsha, this Torah portion, contains 53 of the 613 commandments in the Torah, which is striking because in all of the chapters up until here, which means from Genesis 1 until Exodus 19, I think there have been about 42 commandments altogether. And now in this one chapter, we're going to have 53 of the 613. So it's pretty action-packed with laws. And most of them deal with civil laws and interpersonal relationships. And it's actually a bit of an anomaly. When you think about the structure of the book of Exodus, most of the book of Exodus contains narrative, stories, and actually very dramatic stories. We have, beginning from, let's say, the burning bush where God meets Moses to the 10 plagues in Egypt, and then the dramatic exodus from Egypt and the departure and with the Egyptians chasing after the Israelites, and then coming to the Red Sea and the Red Sea splitting for the Israelites and them crossing in safety, and then the waters coming back and drowning the Egyptian pursuers. And then they come to Mount Sinai, where you have this moment of incredible revelation where God literally speaks to 3 million people. And then, we'll see in a few weeks where they drop the ball and they build a golden calf. I'm sure that when you study that Parsha, you'll have a lot to talk about. And then you have this amazing series of chapters at the end of the book that deal with the building of the tabernacle, the building of what will be in the future, the Holy Temple, the Beit HaMikdash in the desert. And for the years prior to the building of the Holy Temple, it's called the Tabernacle, the Mishkan. But what all these narratives seem to have in common is that they focus on really the presence of God in Israel, the presence of God among the Jewish people, and his relationship with Israel. And, you see this basically coming out in all these stories, these dramatic stories of God's revelation and God's presence and God's being with the people and having them build a place for him to dwell among them. And then you have this big chapter of all these civil laws. It sounds like a law book, and it seems to be a break in the pattern. I think really the message here is very important, though. I think that, Nachmanides calls the book of Exodus the book of redemption. And even though it's only the first part of the book that deals with the redemption from Egypt and the taking the Jews out of slavery and bringing them to freedom, he defines redemption not simply as physical freedom, but really spiritual redemption. The physical redemption from slavery is just part of that. And the whole purpose of coming out of Egypt was so that we could now be a nation that serves God. And so the culmination of that redemption is in the building of this this home base, so to speak, where the Jewish people can have a focus on the presence of God among them. And so really the whole book is geared around this idea of God's presence among the people. And I believe that what Mishpatim is teaching us is that God's presence among us depends upon us building a righteous society. That ultimately God will be telling us that his presence cannot dwell among us unless we're living together righteously as a people, together in harmony. And so this whole chapter of Mishpatim, to a great extent, focuses on the laws of interpersonal relationships and civil law and how to build a righteous and just society. And really, that's going to be the message that the prophets throughout the rest of the Bible are going to be hammering away at the Jewish people. They're saying, look, God gave you a Torah. Those are the instructions where you as individuals and as a society can have a relationship with God. And to a great extent, you know, the Jewish people over history either broke down when it came to idol worship, and many of the prophets had to come and slam them for their idolatry. But then the other major complaint of the prophets was that they were not living ethically. They were not treating the widow and the orphan and the poor properly, etc. And so I think that's really ultimately where this Parsha of Mishpatim comes in this whole book of very amazing narratives about the revelation and presence of God. We're going to see that the laws of the Torah, in terms of how to live in a righteous society and how to live civilly with each other, are organized and based around the principles of justice, righteousness, and human dignity. And what I like to do, at least in the beginning tonight, is to just give a few examples of some of these principles. So Mishpatim begins in the beginning of chapter 21 with the laws of the Eved Ivri. Now, here you have a great example of where the words that we use in translating the Bible can skew really the meaning. And so, you know, we always have this problem where the Bible is written in Hebrew, and yet Westerners, we often not just speak in English and read English, but we think in English. All the words that we use in English have a certain, there's a color to them, there's a flavor to these words, there's a music to these words, and they're often very out of key with the music of the Hebrew. You know, for example, the Hebrew word chet is translated into English as sin. But chet is much, much different than the word people think of when they think of sin. And most of these colorations in the English really were carried down through the Christian Bible. So when we think of these English words, we sort of, they come with a lot of baggage, and they're not baggage from the Hebrew scriptures. So often the word eved, which is the term we're talking about here, is translated as slave. And of course we, you know, growing up now, you know, we have a lot of associations with this word slave and what it means, and certain images come to mind. And it's not really the biblical concept of an eved. Eved might be better translated as either a servant or really an indentured servant, a bondsman. Even some people use the word bondsman. But it's not the kind of slave that we imagine when we think of, you know, a slave that was just less than property of the owner, and the owner could do anything that he wants with the slave. You know, according to Jewish law, especially as elaborated in rabbinic sources and Talmudic sources, there were extremely strict regulations governing the way a master, so to speak, a Baal, is allowed to treat their eved, their servant, their bondsman. What the Torah here says, it speaks about a length of time that the person becomes a Hebrew slave. Basically, there were two ways in which a person could become a Hebrew slave. It wasn't any time it could happen. A person would be able to either sell themselves into servitude if they went into total debt and poverty. They literally were broke and they had not a penny to their name. And so they may basically sell themselves, hire themselves out really as an Eved Ivri to work for their master and to pay off a debt. Or it could be someone that stole, someone that, let's say, took $1,000 from someone, or took something that was worth $1,000, and they're caught. So the penalty in the Bible is kefel, is to pay double. Now, this person obviously stole because they didn't have any money, and now they have to pay back double. They're going to have a tough time coming up with that fine, with that penalty. And so a person who stole and can't pay back the double fine, obviously they'll give back the $1,000 they're caught with, but where's the $1,000 penalty? And so they may have to be sold by the Beit Din, by the court, to work for someone to pay back their fine. But what the Torah says is that they only work for a period of 6 years. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But the question I wanted to ask at the outset is, here we have a number of chapters that are going through civil law, the laws of a just society. And the Torah begins with the laws of slavery. And why is that? Why do we begin with the laws of slavery? So I think one possible thing to consider is that the ethical society can be judged by how it treats those who are on the lowest rung of the totem pole, people with the least amount of power. Usually these are the people that are treated horribly. And so the Torah begins by teaching us right at the outset that no, it's important how we deal with those people who are the most disempowered, who are at the lowest rung of society, who are not totally free agents, but really have the status of being an Eved Ivri, being a bondsman or a Hebrew servant. Also, starting off with the laws of slavery here, and in this huge chapter dealing with, again, how to build a just society, it reminds us of something that the Bible always wants us never to forget, which is that we have to remember that we were slaves in Egypt. And it invokes the principle of empathy, which the Bible will go back to so many times. The Bible is going to say, you know how it feels to be a slave. You know how it means to be someone that's disempowered. And so the Torah keeps on saying to us, since you know how it feels, don't you dare do it to someone else. Don't mistreat someone else. The Torah actually says a little bit later in Exodus chapter 22, verse 20, don't oppress the ger, don't oppress the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You know how it feels to be an outsider. You know how it feels to be a stranger. And therefore, you should never lose sight of that. Always remember that. And that will really help you be more sensitive to how to treat others that are disempowered. And it's interesting that Hillel, the great sage Hillel, when he was asked to summarize all of Judaism on one foot, can you sum everything up just, in 2 minutes? I have 2 minutes, tell me everything. So his colleague Shammai, was insulted by this question. There was actually someone that wasn't Jewish that wanted to convert and approached Shammai and said, teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. And Shammai basically kicked him out and said, well, that's a nervy kind of question. So Hillel was asked the same question, and Hillel says, if you want to understand the whole Torah on one foot, basically the principle is whatever annoys you, whatever really would bother you, don't do to someone else. If it would upset you, don't do it to someone else. And then Hillel says the rest of the Torah is a commentary to this. Now go and study it. But the principle that Hillel works with is the principle of empathy. It would bother you. You know how it feels to have that happen to you. Don't do it to someone else. So we said that the Eved Ivri, this bondsman, this Hebrew servant, will work for 6 years. But then the Torah says something interesting. The Torah says, what if after 6 years he doesn't want to leave? He likes working for this master. He likes the setup. He likes, he just likes this person. He just enjoys being there. Maybe he enjoys the sort of the certaintude of that kind of life. Everything's structured for him. He doesn't have to worry about going out and getting a job. He's got a guaranteed job. So the Torah says, if he wants to do that, if he wants to remain as a servant, the master has to take him, it says in the Torah actually literally, to the Elohim. Literally you would translate it to God. And that's how, almost all Christian commentaries, all Christian translations translate it as the master takes the servant to God. And actually some Jewish translations have that as well, but it's sort of awkward because where are you going to go to bring this servant to God? God doesn't have an office somewhere. So it's understood by Jewish translations and Jewish commentaries to referring to taking this servant to the place where God is present and where the people that God put in charge represent God. We know that, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, God says that when there are issues that need to be decided, don't come to me, God says. I'm putting the judges and the sages and the priests of each generation, they are the ones that will tell you what to do. And so the Beit Din, the court, is the place really where the people that represent God reside. And so the owner takes his slave to the court. And there at the court, he takes the slave and puts his ear up against the doorpost and takes an awl. It's spelled A-W-L. In Hebrew, it's martseah. And he pierces the ear of his slave. It's a pretty gruesome kind of thing to do. And the question is, why? Why put his ear on a doorpost? Why use this particular tool called a martseah? So some of the commentaries point out that the Hebrew word martseah, if you add up the value of the letters, mem, tzadi, resh, ayin, it comes out to the number 400. And 400 was the year that we were supposed to be slaves in Egypt. And so on some level, God is sort of hinting here, you were only supposed to be slaves for a limited amount of time. You weren't supposed to be slaves in Egypt forever. You were supposed to be freed. And so you as well, doing something that's not really quite appropriate to want to extend your servitude. And the same thing that he goes to a door, because really what the Torah is saying is, look, the door was opened for you. You had, after 6 years, the door of freedom that was open for you, and you're choosing to stay as a servant, as a slave. And so the slave is also reminded that the doorpost was one of the central places where God's redemption took place, where the Israelites put the blood of the lamb on the lintels and on the doorposts before they left Egypt. So the doorpost really testifies to the fact that God freed us from slavery. And so if this person wants to continue to be a slave, the ceremony here, the ritual is acted out in a way which sort of it brings it up in his face and says, you sure you really want to remain a slave when we're supposed to be free? God didn't leave us as slaves in Egypt. God redeemed us from 400 years of slavery. And really, that's not what he's supposed to be doing. And it's interesting that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter asks the question, why is it that the Torah requires that the master do this very, very unpleasant thing? I mean, usually in Torah law, if something has to happen to someone, it's the court that carries out the sentence. If someone has to be punished, it's not, let's say the person that was injured that's going to be carrying out the sentence. The court carries out the sentence. So normally you would expect that someone that's on the court or someone appointed by the court will take this awl and pierce the ear of the slave. But the Torah requires, no, it's the owner that has to do this very, very gruesome and unpleasant thing. So the question Rabbi Yisrael Salanter asks is why? Why force the owner to do something which is so unpleasant? And he says that, it's quite possible that the Torah is saying, you, the owner, the master, you bear some responsibility. You were complicit, really, in creating an environment where this person became dependent on you. You should have been, over the course of those 6 years, helping this person gain more self-confidence and gain the kind of, attitude that he doesn't want to remain a slave. I just recently had a discussion with someone that was involved with a organization that was very cultic. And we were discussing the problems of this kind of organization. And I said, normally an educational organization, their goal should be to make their students independent. You want to be able to give your students the tools to be able to study on their own. You don't want your students to have to be dependent on you for the rest of their lives. And I said, the problem with the organization that you were part of is that they didn't give you any tools to study independently. They wanted you to keep on coming back to them. They have all the answers. And I said, that's not really the kind of ethic that an educator should have. And so the Torah is saying to the owner here of the slave, the master, your responsibility was not just to employ this person, but to help build them up so that after 6 years, they're not going to want to remain dependent on you and subservient to you and under your control and a slave to you and a servant to you. They should be, during those 6 years, itching for freedom. Mm-hmm. This is not the ideal state. And so because the owner, the master, was complicit in really fostering that kind of a dependent relationship, he was enabling the servant to sort of remain crippled on that level. He's required to do this very unpleasant thing. If we jump over to the 21st chapter and the 37th verse, so we have a very interesting law. We mentioned before that if you stole something biblically and you were caught, so you would pay back double. So if you stole 1 cow, you'd pay back 2 cows. If you stole, 1 lawnmower, you'd pay back 2 lawnmowers. And if you stole a bag of $1,000, you got to pay back $2,000 in cash. That's the law of paying double. But in the Bible here, we're given a special law. What happens if someone steals an animal, but in the interim, before they're caught, and they could just return it with another animal, in the interim, they've either slaughtered this animal or have sold it. So now the animal they stole is no longer in their possession. They either sold the animal or they slaughtered the animal. So the Torah says something interesting. If the animal we're talking about was an ox, they have to pay back 5 times the value of the ox. But if it's a sheep that they stole, and in the interim they either sold or slaughtered the sheep, they only have to pay back 4 times the value of the sheep. So why is that? Why is it that when it comes to an ox, the Torah requires that you pay back 5 times the value, but when it comes to stealing a sheep, it's only 4 times the value? It's a very interesting question, and it's not so clear why there's a distinction between those 2 animals. So the Talmud suggests, this is a passage in Tractate Baba Kama 79b, that there's a difference between these 2 animals. When you think about someone that steals an ox, for example, what they're going to do is take the ox and lead it. Let's say, they're going to take a stick and maybe hit it from behind, or they're going to maybe put a rope around it and just lead the ox away. How is the person going to steal a sheep? So the sheep's not going to walk on the end of a leash. And what the Talmud suggests is that the person who's going to steal a sheep is going to probably have to carry it on his shoulders to take it away. And what the Talmud suggests is that that's demeaning. It's embarrassing. First of all, to have to put the animal on your shoulders, and carry it, it's both demeaning and it's embarrassing. Whereas to lead the ox away on its own 2 feet, it's not really such an unpleasant activity. And so the Talmud says, because taking the sheep on your shoulders and carrying it away is so unpleasant for you, that person who stole the sheep is more likely to regret what they did than the person who steals the ox. And so, what happens is, because the person who stole the ox really didn't have really much of an opportunity and is less likely that that person's going to regret what they did. And also there was no, let's say, unpleasantness and almost a downside to having stolen the ox. So they pay the larger fine. They pay the 5 times the value. But if they are going to have to go through the embarrassment and the humiliation and the unpleasantness of having to carry the animal on their shoulders, so both the experience itself is so unpleasant, the penalty is diminished a bit, and this person probably reached a certain feeling that maybe I did something that was not right. What's interesting that's pointed out by the commentaries is that if the Torah here is going to diminish a person's punishment because they felt less, let's say, passionate about the sin they committed, they feel bad about their sin. So some of the commentaries say that the same thing happens on the flip side, that if we did something that was positive and virtuous and we don't feel so great about it, let's say we gave charity to people and we feel, miserable about it. So it's possible that the reward we would normally get for doing something virtuous will be diminished. So it's not only that God looks at what we do, but God looks at the heart as well, and at the attitude. And so we should always feel bad about what we've done wrong, and we should feel great about what we've done that was right. Now in chapter 22, so we're going to the next chapter now, and the very end of chapter 22, so the Torah says something interesting. The Torah says, Anshe Kodesh Tihiyu Li. People of holiness shall you be to me. The Kotzker Rebbe used to say that, the Torah says we shall be people of holiness. It doesn't say you'll be angels. Right? Human beings can never be angels. We have to serve God with all of our humanity. We're not supposed to escape, what it means to be human. We're not going to live as angels. And so the Torah starts off by saying here, you've got to be people that are holy. And then it says that if there's an animal of yours that was torn in the field, let's say you had a flock of sheep, and an animal came and mauled one of your sheep, so you're not allowed to eat that sheep. The Torah here says that if an animal was torn in the field, you're not allowed to eat it. That's called in Hebrew treifa. Basically, we know that to eat any kind of animal that is the kind of species you're allowed to eat, it has to be slaughtered in a certain way. And if the animal dies without being slaughtered properly, we're not allowed to eat it. So that's one thing the Torah tells us here, because, it could be that, let's say, the animal was only mauled and it wasn't killed. But the law of treifa is that if it was mauled in such a way that the wounds that it received would end in the animal dying within a certain period of time, then the animal is not kosher, even if you slaughter it yourself later on. And then the Torah says here, you shall throw it to the dog. Lakelev tashlichuhu. Throw it to the dog. Why is that? The Torah, the Talmud, actually, some of the commentaries point out that, no good deed ever goes unrewarded. And so the Talmud points out that since when the Jews left Egypt, they didn't bark. The dogs didn't bark at the Israelites. So maybe that's one reason why they're getting this reward here. But the Da'at Zekanim, Balei HaTosafot, this is a commentary to the Torah, which is a very wonderful commentary. They point out something interesting. They say, when you think about it, what kind of case are we talking about here? Talking about a case where it's not some wild animals that doesn't belong to you that was mauled in the field, that's none of your concern. And you can't eat it anyway. It's really talking about your animal, one of your flock that was mauled. And, usually a person has a dog that would be protecting their flocks. No one's going to be up all night watching their sheep. And so the master will be sleeping at night, but the dog is out there watching the flocks. And hopefully if any animals like a wolf comes to attack the sheep, the dog will bark and chase the attackers away. So this is obviously talking about a case, the Das Akanim and Balei Tosava point out, where the dog didn't do its job, right? This was a night where the dog let you down, and it was asleep at the job, or it was, who knows what, it was dreaming, and the wolf gets in, and the wolf attacks one of your sheep, and now you can't eat it anymore. You've lost a sheep. It's very valuable. And so the Torah says here, at this moment, when you might be really upset with your dog, it says, take this carcass, which the dog usually didn't get to eat, right? Usually the dog either ate, garbage, or at the end of, the humans in the family, the animal that was slaughtered, maybe it got a couple of bones under the table. But here you're giving the animal the whole carcass, everything on it. It's a huge, like a buffet, a whole grand meal for the dog at a moment when he's disappointed you, he's let you down. And the lesson here is quite amazing. Because the truth is, the Das Akanim Balei Tosava would point out, that this dog normally did its job day in and day out. This is not a daily occurrence that it let you down, that it allowed a wolf to get in. Normally, it watches very carefully, takes care of your flocks, and unfortunately, you take it for granted because you say to yourself, well, that's what the animal's supposed to do. You never give it a second thought that every night the dog is up watching your flocks. And the same thing happens with other people in our lives, that people that, let's say, work for us, or even people who work for others that we rely upon. It could be the person that checks your groceries at the supermarket. They do a job which is not easy, and it's not necessarily the most pleasant job in the world, and they do it. It's thankless, and people just say to themselves, well, they're doing their job, they're making their money, and it's not until they maybe make a mistake on your bill that you get all upset with them. And what happens is we don't really ever thank them for the job they do, because we say to ourselves, they're doing their job, and we take it for granted. So the Torah is saying here, you got used to the fact that this dog did its job for you all the time, and you took it for granted. You usually don't make a big deal about the fact that the dog took care of your sheep.
That's
so
awesome.
Now at this evening, at this time, when the dog didn't do its job properly, and now a wolf got in and mauled one of your sheep, and now you're out. It's very expensive. You're losing a whole sheep. Torah says, give it to your dog, and show the dog appreciation for all those times it did its job perfectly well, but you never went out of your way to thank it.
That's amazing. Wow.
The Torah is quite amazing.
That's amazing.
And I think obviously it's an important lesson for all of us who, have people that, we have the same relationship with. If we go to verse 24 in chapter 21, so you have here the very infamous law called Lex Talionis, which is the law of retaliation. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. You'll find the exact same law in Leviticus 24, verse 20, and Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 21. So the Torah speaks about this 3 times. But here's the first time we have it in Exodus chapter 21, verse 24. And what does it mean? When people read this, they sort of want to squirm in their seats. You mean if I'm fighting with you when I poke out your eye, so the Torah seems to be saying that, well, we're going to bring you to the court, and the court's going to have one of your eyes poked out. If we were fighting with knives and I chopped off your hand, so they're going to chop off the hand of the attacker. That's what it sounds like. And it's interesting that um, I've seen many Christian commentaries, not all, but many Christian commentaries that try to struggle with the meaning of this verse. They say, well, what the Torah is really teaching you is that you can't take out more than an eye for an eye, meaning that they understand the Torah here to be setting limits. And it's not as if someone hurts you and, you can, drop an atomic bomb on their head. So if someone, chops off your hand, you can't kill them. And so the way many Christian commentaries understand this teaching is that the Torah is telling you it's only an eye for an eye. You can't take more than an eye for an eye. But it's clear that they understand the meaning of this passage as quite literal, that literally speaking, you could take an eye for an eye. You could take someone's hand if they took off your hand. The reality is that Jews never understood this verse in that way. Jews never in history carried out this kind of punishment where someone might have their hand chopped off or their eye taken out, ever. This is simply not the way we ever understood this verse. And the reason is very simple. The reason is because according to the oral Torah, God explained and clarified that the law here is that we don't actually take an eye for an eye, but rather we pay monetary compensation for the physical damage. Now, just to back up for a moment, we basically say, as Jews who stood at Mount Sinai, the Torah says in Isaiah chapter 43, we are God's witnesses. The Israelites testify really to the world about what God did. And so the testimony of Israel is that God did not only reveal a written text to us at Mount Sinai, we who stood there also received an oral transmission from God that God wanted us to keep as an oral teaching. But the revelation was not simply a book that God gave us. And so the text of the Bible was explained and clarified and amplified by God so that we would understand what it means. So in this passage where the text of Exodus says, ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, God said, that's not what you do. You actually have to pay for 5 different things. You have to pay for the value of the limb, so the court will assess the value of a limb. How much is an eye worth? How much is a hand worth? And the court will make an assessment. The attacker has to pay for the medical treatment. So whatever it costs to treat the victim, the attacker has to pay for that. The attacker has to pay for lost wages. So if this person was not going to be able to work for 6 months, the attacker has to pay for those lost wages. The attacker has to pay for the pain the victim experienced. So they will try to assess how much pain the person went through, and they will be compensated for the pain and for the embarrassment. So if there's any embarrassment, for example, to have to walk around for the rest of his life with an eye patch rather than 2 eyes showing, they'll make an assessment of the embarrassment as well, not just the physical pain, but the emotional pain. Now, the Talmud basically explains why it's impossible to understand this verse literally. Why is it that it could not mean an eye for an eye literally? Now, before we get to the Talmud's explanation, there are 2 other problems. Problem number 1 is that it's simply barbaric, meaning that if the Torah was telling us that if an attacker chops off someone's hand, the courts would go and chop off his hand, that's a barbaric thing to do. Number 2, it would be something that totally doesn't help the victim, meaning that if the victim has his eye poked out and the court pokes out the eye of the attacker, how does that help the victim? The victim's still going to be blind in one eye, and there's no compensation. The third problem is that to actually take out an eye for an eye or a hand for a hand would not be fair. So number one, it's barbaric. Number two, it wouldn't help the victim. Number three, the Talmud insists it wouldn't be fair. Why not? So the Talmud gives an example. What if the attacker was someone who only had one eye to begin with? You had a one-eye attacker, and he pokes out someone's eye. So now the court's supposed to take out his one remaining eye? I mean, obviously, the person who lost one eye can still see with one eye. You can't see everything, you're not quite as clearly, but you can see. Just try it. Close your eye now, one eye, and you'll see almost everything.
Right.
But if the attacker only had one eye and the court removes his one remaining eye, he'll be totally blind. Or imagine a case where the attacker is a surgeon or a pianist or a pilot, and he attacks an opera singer. So the opera singer can sing without a hand. But if you remove a hand from a pilot or a surgeon or a pianist, they won't be able to do their profession for the rest of their life. So to actually carry out this kind of physical retaliation would not be, in most cases, fair at all. Now, the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, explains that this idea of financial compensation is actually hinted at in the text itself. It's quite amazing how he shows this. The Hebrew is ayin tachat ayin. Ayin means eye. Tachat literally means underneath.
Right.
So it's ayin tachat ayin, an eye underneath an eye. Well, that's sort of strange. What it probably would mean is an eye in place of an eye. But if you translate it literally, ayin tachat ayin, the way the Gaon of Vilna explains is that the Torah is saying, ayin, if you take out someone's eye, what's the penalty? It's what is underneath, tachat ayin. And he says that what it's really hinting at is you go to the letter in the alphabet underneath the letters in the word ayin. So after ayin, ayin is spelled ayin yud nun. So in the Hebrew alphabet, what's underneath or after ayin is pei, the letter pei or fei. And the next letter in ayin is yud. After yud comes chaf. And the next letter in ayin is nun. And after nun comes samach. So the Gaon of Vilna says if you take the letters that come after the letters in the word ayin, I, you get the letters chaf, samach, fei, or pei, which spells out kesef, money.
Wow.
So the Torah is hinting that what is the penalty for taking out someone's ayin, their eye? It's the letters that come under tachat ayin, which are the letters spelling out kesef. Now we have a huge question that anyone that's sort of thinking would ask, a very obvious question. The question is, if that's the case, if God's intention is that we pay financial compensation for physical harm by maiming someone, why didn't the text of the Torah just say that? Why didn't the Torah text say money for an eye? That should have been what the Torah said. If that's the intention all along, why does it say an eye for an eye, which can be read literally as remove the person's eye? If that's not God's intention, so why didn't the Torah simply write what God's intention ultimately is, that you pay money for an eye? So commentaries point out that had the Torah said that, imagine if the Torah had said, money for an eye. That's the most crass kind of thing you can imagine. What it would be saying is, what, if you take out someone's eye, well, you write him a check and that's it. It sounds so, dehumanizing. It sort of doesn't really express the kind of horror that the action really was. I mean, you can just simply take out someone's eye or chop off their arm and you just write them a check and that's it? Does that really make any sense? Is that really justice? Is that really justice? Mm-hmm. And so the commentaries point out something amazing, that the Torah here, because the Torah is stereophonic, right? The Torah is stereo. We don't only have sound coming out of one speaker. We have two. We have the written and the oral, and they complement each other. The written text wouldn't want to say money for an eye because that would be crass. So the written text says, you know what? If you poke out someone's eye, you know what you deserve? Because you did something so disgusting and so barbaric and so horrible, on some level you deserve that your eye should be taken out. Because the Torah wants you to realize how horrible, how disgusting your act was. And you wouldn't realize it possibly if all you had to do was write a check.
Mm-hmm.
So the Torah is teaching you, you should understand how disgusting your behavior was. And the Torah says, you know what, sir, on some level, your eye should be taken out. However, the oral Torah says it would be barbaric, and it would be unfair, and it wouldn't help the victim. So the oral Torah gives us what we do in practice. In practice, the criminal has to compensate for these 5 types of compensation. But he shouldn't think that that's all that he really, would need to do. Really, it's not simply writing a check and that's justice. He has to understand that no, ultimately his act was horrible to the extent that on some theoretical level he should have his eye taken out. So when we read the Torah stereoscopically, we really get both messages. The written text is telling us how serious the crime is, and the oral Torah is teaching us what in practice, practically speaking, has to be done. There's so much more. I think we'll end with one last piece.
I was wondering how you thought you might be able to make it the rest of the way through this. It's not going to happen.
Well, there's always more for next year, but
Yep.
it's a very rich chapter. In chapter 23, verse 8. So the Torah tells us we shouldn't accept a bribe. Don't accept a bribe because a bribe will blind the eyes of the wise. Now, obviously, it's referring there to judges. And it's the kind of teaching, it's the kind of law that doesn't seem to affect all of us every day of our lives because not all of us are judges. But the commentaries point out that really every single law in the Bible can be seen on many different levels. So, for example, when it says don't steal, it doesn't only mean not to take someone's, wallet when they're not looking. Not stealing, according to the commentaries, has different shades of meaning, different levels of meaning. For example, if you wake someone up in the middle of the night, that's called gezel shena. You're stealing your sleep. If you mislead someone, I remember when I was in junior high school, and even high school, I think I would bring home a lot of books. Right at the end of the day, so my parents would think that I was studying a lot. Anytime you try and give a false impression, that's called geneva dat. You're stealing someone's mind. You're misleading them. So there are all kinds of theft, and there really is a fine tuning and a coarse tuning to everything. So accepting a bribe is not just something that's important for judges. There's a famous book written by Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman. He was the head of the yeshiva in Baranovich, and he and his whole yeshiva were killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. And the famous story behind it, because he gathered all his students together before they were executed and gave them an amazing speech that they're going to be sacrifices now and they have to prepare themselves to be pure sacrifices. But he wrote an amazing book called Kovetz Ma'amorim, which is basically it's a book of essays. And in the first essay, it's called Al Ha'amuna, about faith. And he speaks there about faith in God. And he says that basically his hypothesis is not that we have to somehow make a case for faith in God, and that it's hard to believe in God, and you have to sort of come up with these clever ways of proving God existence. He says no, the belief in God, he says, is the most obvious thing in the world. So imagine that Adam and Eve are created; they're the first people off the assembly line, and he says if you would have asked Adam and Eve, how did you get here? you know, they wouldn't have said, well, we just popped into existence out of nowhere. They would have understood that they were created. We have a story in the Talmud where a skeptic comes to, I think it was Rabbi Akiva, I believe, and says, who created the world? And Rabbi Akiva says, well, God created the world. And the skeptic says, well, prove it. So Rabbi Akiva says to him, what are you wearing? He says, I'm wearing I'm wearing a garment. And Rabbi Akiva says, well, who made it? And he says, well, a tailor made it, some kind of whatever, someone that makes garments made it. So Rabbi Akiva says, prove it. What do you mean prove it? It's obvious. It's a piece of clothing. It was made by someone who makes clothing, a tailor. So Rabbi Akiva said, look, if it's obvious that you needed a tailor to make your clothing, then obviously the world didn't come into existence by itself either. Mm-hmm. And he says that, Aristotle, he says, was one of the greatest philosophers that ever lived. Aristotle understood that the world had a beginning and the world was created. He believed, unfortunately, that God that created the world went on vacation and doesn't control and direct the world, but he believed there was a creator. And Elchanan Wasserman says that really it's the most obvious thing in the world. Either the world popped into existence all by itself or there was a creator. And he says that nothing just pops into existence. He tells a story about this person that comes to a rabbi's house and, sees this beautiful painting. And he's a skeptic. And he says to the rabbi, how did you get that painting? He says, well, it's interesting that you asked because I had this big blank piece of canvas. And one day this lightning bolt struck and it scared my cat. And the cat jumped up onto the table and knocked over all the the cans of paint on the table, and all the paint spilled over, and it produced this beautiful painting. And the guy says, what are you, crazy? That's impossible. He says, you're telling me that you had a big bang and all of these molecules and particles and atoms just happened to form a universe. He says, no, when you see something that looks like it was designed, there was a designer to it. So he begins with the premise that the most obvious thing in the world is that the world has a creator. Now he's got a problem. If it's so obvious that the world has a creator, how can you have anyone in the world who doesn't believe in God? That's what puzzles him. He's not puzzled by how do you prove that God exists. He's puzzled by the non-believer. He can't understand how does someone with a brain deny the fact that the world has a creator. And he quotes this verse in Exodus. He says, don't accept a bribe because the bribe will blind the eyes of the wise. He says the truth is that we have a vested interest in not having a God. Because if there's a God that created the world, the same God that said, let there be light, is the same God that said, thou shalt not kill. And the same God that created the first is the same God that says, thou shalt not steal. And the truth is that we don't want that. We don't want to have something over us. When Abraham met with Avimelech, Avimelech was very insulted that you had to tell me that Sarah is your sister. Why didn't you just say that she's your wife? And Abraham says, no, because you don't fear God. There's no fear of God in this place. You would kill me because of my wife. I mean, what's to stop you? Of course you are very cultured and you're very civilized, but if you really wanted my wife that badly, there's nothing stopping you from just killing me and taking her. And so what Elchanan Wasserman says is that there's a great bribe that we have that basically says, no, there's no God in the world. And if there's no God, then there's no absolute right and wrong. Basically, right and wrong is determined by what you think is right and wrong. And so because everyone has that as part of them, where I don't want someone over me that tells me what to do. I want independence. I want to be my own boss. I don't need to have something that's over me and cramping my style. And that bribe that wants me to live a life without restrictions, that's the bribe that gets in the way of believing in God. So Elchanan Wasserman says to each of us, don't accept the bribe because the bribe will blind your eyes. Okay, I think really maybe a good place to end.
Okay.
Even though I have a lot more.
Sure.
But, I think
it's very difficult to fit so much information in just 1 hour. So, but I would say it was some really good, juicy points that you brought out and some really interesting things for me personally that I really enjoyed. I never heard the part about the dog part. That was just like, Wow. It's almost counterintuitive, not only to human nature, but also counterintuitive to the teachings of the New Testament, of New Testament believers. It would suggest that that Hashem is like this rude, fierce God in the sky with a lightning bolt ready to kill and destroy. He's really a merciful and kind and loving God, and is doing, all of his statutes and judgments are so like caring and loving in the sense of things. So it's really nice to very refreshing, Rabbi, to have these things pointed out.
I think that when we take David's perspective, you read Psalm 119, and he speaks about the wisdom and the beauty and the brilliance of each of God's commandments. The truth is that on the surface they look very, very simple. You read these chapters in Exodus here, and they just seem like some rule book from civil law class. But the truth is that each one of these laws, we didn't really have a chance to explore them very, very deeply tonight. But each one of these laws, again, has a coarse tuning and a fine tuning. And they have tremendous spiritual lessons for every single thing in the Torah. And so really the challenge of studying the Torah properly is to try to really come to appreciate the depth of all the laws and the beauty of all the laws that God gave us. They're not simply a rule book of civics, a civics class, but it's really all spiritual teachings as well.
Well, I'll tell you what, I certainly enjoyed it, Rabbi. Thank you so much. Glad it all worked out. Glad we hung in there and got this thing through. Baruch Hashem. So, ladies and gentlemen, until next week, we will see you again. We will pull off Acts chapter 1 next Sunday at this time slot. So hang in there. It's headed your way. Shalom, everyone. Shalom, Rabbi.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד. חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה.